Hello. There was a 23-year-old woman from Mexico who dreamed of coming to a foreign land. She thought that with her hard work and determination, she could change the fate of her family and herself. Little did she know that as soon as she set foot abroad, she would fall into a den of demons. For over a year, she endured inhumane treatment. In the end, she died tragically in a foreign land. Her death shocked the United States and the international community. Even the judge had to exclaim that this was a brutal crime that could not be forgiven. So what happened that year? Let's go back in time to 2015 to learn the details of the incident. The story takes place in New York City. According to the 2023 population report, the total population of New York City has reached 8.8 million people. Among them, permanent residents, simply understood as people who are not citizens of a country, but have the right to live and work legally in that country for a long time, account for 3.1 million people. The non-permanent resident population is mainly a large number of foreign workers, of which the proportion of foreign domestic helpers accounts for about 15%. These are the people we usually call domestic helpers. Foreign domestic helpers in New York City mainly come from 3 countries: Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And our story today begins with a Mexican woman carrying her dream, preparing to leave for New York City. Maria Gonzalez was a 23-year-old single mother. To give her family a better life in 2015, she was determined to leave her hometown alone to work in the unfamiliar New York City, hoping that through her own efforts, she could change the fate of her entire family. This decision was full of difficulties and uncertainties, but she was still full of hope for the future. She was born in 1992 in a remote village in Chiapas, Mexico. Her parents were both farmers, so Mexico's economy was very backward at that time. Chiapas was also one of the poorest states in Mexico. Her village was in the mountains, 70 kilometers away from the nearest town by foot on mountain roads. You can imagine how difficult life was there. For them, having enough to eat was their only wish. The whole family often had to go hungry. The main reason was that the family had too many children. Her parents had 11 children, and Maria was the 3rd child. The family's life was already very difficult, and misfortunes came one after another. When she was 4 years old, her parents passed away one after another. The burden of food and clothing for the whole family fell on the shoulders of the older siblings who were still very young. In the next 10 years, 5 of her younger brothers and sisters passed away one after another, mainly due to hunger, cold, and illness. Although she had the opportunity to go to school, at the age of 15, Maria had to drop out to work in the fields because there were still many young siblings who needed to be taken care of. In the following years, she was always busy with farm work. At the age of 18, she met and fell in love with a boy from the same village. In 2012, before getting married, Maria became pregnant with her boyfriend's child. Having a child before marriage should have been a complete joy, but that cowardly boy didn't want to take responsibility. He ran away. Although the family was very poor, Maria didn't want to give up her own child. The following year, she gave birth to a lovely baby boy and became a single mother. The life of the mother and child was extremely difficult. To earn money to support her child and family, she started doing odd jobs, carrying loads at construction sites near the town. It was a very hard job and the salary was not high, but due to circumstances, she had no other choice. While working, she happened to hear that the salary for working in New York City was very high. The monthly income was at least 3 to 4 times higher than her current income. Many Mexican women went to New York City to work as domestic helpers to give their families a better life. Maria, a poorly educated woman who had never been far from home, decided to give it a try. She thought that she could do all the work of a domestic helper. Her plan was to go to New York City to work for about 3 years. The income from 3 years would be enough for her to return to Mexico to build a new house and buy land. She had also discussed with her siblings to leave her son in the care of her elder sister. The whole family supported her decision. After all, this was a way out. After making up her mind, Maria began to prepare the necessary things to go to New York City. Because she was still 2 months short of being 23 years old, which didn't meet the minimum age requirement for foreign domestic workers in New York City at that time, she had to pay a sum of money to have someone change her date of birth to 2 months earlier. After obtaining her passport, Maria set off for New York City in May 2015. For a country much more developed than Mexico, Maria felt everything was new and full of hope for the future. In New York City, Maria underwent professional training, registration, and a series of other procedures before officially becoming a domestic helper. She waited to be hired and was quickly employed by a family. The employer was a 35-year-old housewife named Sarah Johnson. She had 2 children, a 4-year-old daughter and a son who was only a few months old. Clearly, for New York families like this, hiring a domestic helper was the best choice. In fact, Sarah had hired up to 4 domestic helpers before, but for some unknown reason, they all didn't work out in the end. Maria was the 5th domestic helper hired by the family. Sarah's apartment was located in the central area of New York City. The building at 145 11th Avenue was a 3-bedroom apartment, considered quite spacious in New York City. Of course, besides her and her 2 children, there was her husband, Michael Johnson, a 37-year-old New York City police officer, and her mother, Elizabeth Brown, 57 years old, all living in this apartment. In addition, there were 2 other tenants in the house. Including Maria, there were a total of 8 people living in the apartment. On May 28th, when Maria first stepped into this apartment, she knew that she would have to spend a year or even longer here. This would be her home in New York City. Here we need to add a bit. In New York City, in addition to paying salaries and buying insurance for domestic helpers, employers also have a very important obligation to provide accommodation. It can be understood that the domestic helper lives at the employer's home. It can be said that once you hire a domestic helper, they are a member of your family. However, the living conditions of domestic helpers are usually not very good. In many cases, it is not even considered a room. The employer will provide a very small storage room or simply set up a sleeping place. Looking at the number of people living in Sarah's family, it can be seen that Maria's living conditions were certainly not optimistic. Her main duties were to take care of the 2 children, clean the house, cook, and do other odd jobs. It can be said that she did almost everything. Although it was very tiring, for someone who had been used to hardship since childhood like her, these tasks were nothing. In the following days, Maria just worked hard, trying to complete everything as perfectly as possible. But before long, she began to feel that something was not right. The employer, Sarah, was too strict. She always had very high demands for everything, for example, complaining that Maria ate too much, worked too slowly, didn't clean well, etc. She also almost never smiled. This made Maria feel a bit discouraged and unhappy, far from what she had imagined. But because she had come here to earn money, she had to endure it. After all, no money is easy to earn. To avoid angering her employer, Maria could only work harder, trying not to leave any mistakes to be scolded for. But it seemed that didn't work, because no matter how hard she tried, she was still scolded every day. More importantly, not only Sarah, but her mother, Elizabeth, also participated in supervising and disciplining her strictly. At first, the mother and daughter only scolded her, but over time, their methods escalated. They even forbade Maria from using the phone and didn't give her any rest time, including her 1 day off per week. Of course, in order to earn extra income, Maria reluctantly agreed to work overtime. She hoped she could quickly save enough money and return home in glory. By October, although Maria had become more and more obedient, almost slavishly following all the employer's requests, the outrageous thing was that Sarah and her mother not only did not restrain themselves, but became even more daring. They were no longer limited to verbal abuse, but began to beat her frequently, multiple times a day. Despite this, Maria still endured and tolerated it. This stemmed from her experiences since childhood. Her childhood was full of hardships, going through all kinds of bitterness, so she was used to enduring and suffering. However, this yielding of hers made Sarah and her mother become more and more brutal. They not only slapped and pulled her hair, but also kicked her. They even used many types of tools to torture her. Once they even used a hot iron to press against her hand. In addition to being physically attacked, Maria's life was also strictly controlled. Every day she was only allowed to sleep for 5 hours, had no rest during the day, was only allowed to eat leftovers and bread soaked in water, and was even restricted from going to the bathroom. Under the torment of the mother and daughter, Maria became thinner and more haggard, and her mental state began to become panicked. During a health check in October, the doctor discovered many scars on Maria's body. Sarah explained that the domestic helper often worked clumsily and fell many times, so this happened. Her husband, Michael, also reported that the domestic helper had many problems. But when the authorities suggested changing the domestic helper, he refused. In addition, Maria herself did not report to the agency about what she had to endure, so the matter was dropped. She had missed the best opportunity to escape from this den of demons. Time passed until July 26, 2016, which was the 14th month since Maria came to work for this family. Early that morning at 7:30, Sarah found Maria lying unconscious on the floor, not getting up to work. She angrily shook Maria hard, but she had no reaction. At this time, her mother Elizabeth also ran over. The two tried everything, but still couldn't wake Maria up. Thinking about what had happened the night before and early this morning, the two became frightened. At 9:30 in the morning, Sarah called a doctor named Dr. Lisa Anderson, saying that someone in the house was injured, and asking the doctor to come immediately. However, Dr. Anderson was with a patient at that time and couldn't come right away. She advised Sarah to call an ambulance, but Sarah insisted on waiting for Dr. Anderson to come. At 10:50 in the morning, Dr. Anderson finally arrived. After a preliminary examination, she determined that Maria had died. Based on the body temperature, it could be seen that the victim had died some time ago. Hearing this, Sarah looked worried. She lied, "It's impossible, I just saw her move just now." As a professional doctor, Dr. Anderson immediately realized that this family was talking nonsense, and when she looked at the emaciated domestic helper, she knew for sure there was a hidden story here. Therefore, she asked Sarah to quickly call the police and said she would only leave after the police arrived. However, at this time, Sarah hesitated and didn't call the police. Instead, she called her husband, a police officer, to inform him of the situation and asked him to come home. Noticing something unusual, Dr. Anderson had to call the police herself. At 11:26, medical staff arrived before the police. The forensic staff conducted an autopsy and discovered shocking facts. They said this was an unprecedented case in their career history. The victim, Maria, 24 years old, was emaciated, weighing only 53 pounds, just skin and bones, severely malnourished. With such a weight, even a normal person would have difficulty surviving, let alone having to do housework frequently. According to the health check records, on May 28, 2015, when she first arrived at the employer's house, she weighed 86 pounds. So in just 14 months, her weight had decreased by 38%. Moreover, her body was full of wounds. There were at least 31 new wounds and 47 old wounds. On her right arm, there was a burn from an iron. Her neck was almost entirely bruised. Her fingernails were broken. The cause of death was suffocation after severe trauma to the neck area. Looking at the autopsy results, anyone could see that Maria must have endured brutal torture for a long time before she died. The main suspect was the employer, Sarah. The police immediately arrested Sarah and her mother. Her husband, Michael, a police officer, was also arrested a few days later. The prosecutors charged Sarah and her mother with first-degree murder. As for Michael, due to having an alibi at the time of the incident, he was not charged with first-degree murder. However, considering that Maria had been abused for a long time, he certainly couldn't escape involvement. Therefore, he faced charges of causing serious injury and was suspended from duty. Due to the incident occurring in the house without witnesses, plus the fact that the defendants firmly denied the charges, claiming they had never beaten or scolded the domestic helper, leading to a serious lack of evidence, the investigation faced many difficulties. However, a surprise occurred. After the case was exposed, it caused a great shock in New York City. A New York City resident, after watching the news, immediately provided the police with important evidence: a hard drive from a surveillance camera. This hard drive revealed the cruel truth that had been hidden for so long. It turned out that Michael, the police officer husband, had installed several surveillance cameras in the house. The original purpose might have been to monitor the domestic helper and children, but unexpectedly, it ended up becoming the clearest evidence. During the search for the surveillance camera hard drive, there was a noteworthy detail. Michael initially told the police that he had removed the cameras at the beginning of 2016 at the request of the tenants. However, after investigation, the police discovered that the removal of the cameras was done after the incident occurred. He was afraid that this evidence would be unfavorable to his wife and mother-in-law, so he deliberately destroyed the evidence. For the above charge, the court sentenced Michael to 3 years in prison. After checking, the police confirmed that the hard drive recorded images from June 21, 2016 to July 26. After carefully examining the content inside, people couldn't help but be shocked and outraged at the brutal acts that were recorded. Due to the extreme brutality of the acts recorded in the surveillance camera, I cannot go into detail but will only mention some representative days with recorded footage. On the evening of June 21st at 9:58 p.m., it's unclear what came over Sarah, but she suddenly took a bottle of cold water from the refrigerator and poured it straight onto Maria's head. On the morning of June 24th at 7:51 a.m., Maria was ironing clothes when Sarah suddenly approached, knocked on her head, then walked away. Immediately after, she came back, took the hot iron, and pressed it against Maria's forehead. Not stopping there, she pressed the iron against the victim's right arm. On the afternoon of July 13th at 4:30 p.m., Sarah thought that the stove and kitchen floor tiles weren't cleaned properly, so she dragged Maria into the kitchen. Then she cursed, slapped her face, and punched her in the stomach. In the early morning of July 15th, at 12:26 a.m., Sarah dragged Maria to the window, used a rope to tie her to the window bars. Although the victim begged profusely, Sarah didn't care at all. It wasn't until 5:41 a.m. the next morning that she untied her. In fact, from July 15 to July 26, the day she was killed, for 12 consecutive nights, Maria was tied to the window bars, sleeping on the cold floor. Occasionally, Sarah would cruelly pour cold water on her. Moreover, over 35 days of surveillance camera monitoring showed that Maria was never well fed. Every day she was only given bread soaked in water or a little leftover food. That's why she became frighteningly thin. Not being able to sleep, not being able to eat, yet having to work continuously put Maria in an extremely dangerous situation. Her body was exhausted and her mind was in panic. In this state, the fatal blow occurred. Around 11:40 p.m. on July 25th, when Maria was doing laundry, Sarah thought she was washing too slowly, so she rushed in to beat her, punching and kicking her neck, pulling her hair. Due to the violent attack, Maria staggered at the bathroom door. Sarah still didn't let up, continuing to hit her head, causing her to collapse to the ground. After trying for a while, Maria still couldn't get up. Not stopping there, Sarah thought Maria was pretending to faint to avoid work, so she called her mother. The mother and daughter took a bucket of cold water from the bathroom and poured it straight onto Maria. After pouring water, they dragged her into the room, used their feet to kick her stomach, and made her wear wet clothes to sleep on the floor. Her hands still tied to the window. At this time, Maria was extremely exhausted. She only begged, "Please give me something to eat. I'm so hungry." But even such a simple request was ruthlessly rejected. At 12:11 a.m. on July 26, Sarah suddenly went towards Maria, kicked her in the stomach, reminding her to pay attention to the alarm clock lest she forget. At 4:57 a.m., Sarah woke up again. Seeing that Maria didn't respond to her calls, she became even more furious. Besides punching and kicking, she also used her feet to stomp on Maria's head and neck, grabbed her hair and yanked it back hard, and attacked her neck. Forensic experts believe that the victim's fingernails were broken at this time, and it was also at this moment that she died from suffocation after being brutally tortured. After being abused so savagely, Maria still showed no reaction. Sarah and her mother finally realized something was wrong. However, they still didn't choose to save her, but continued to pour cold water on Maria. Seeing that Maria was still unresponsive, they left her there and went back to their rooms to sleep. Early that morning, Michael also saw Maria. Perhaps he had become accustomed to this scene, so he didn't pay much attention and went to work as usual. Then the events unfolded as described above. Sarah called the doctor. After reviewing the surveillance camera footage and calculating based on each act of abuse, Sarah faced at least 115 charges, most of which were for abuse and causing injury. However, the prosecutors believed that it was only necessary to prosecute 28 charges, with the remaining 87 charges to be considered during the sentencing process. Ordinarily, with a case having such clear evidence, the trial process should have been quite simple, punishing the right person for the right crime. However, no one expected that in a case with such clear evidence, the trial process would be so difficult. First, Sarah and her mother, Elizabeth, during their detention, both claimed that they had mental illnesses and their conditions were very severe. To clarify this issue, the prosecutors immediately appointed specialist doctors to conduct psychiatric assessments of the two defendants. The assessment process lasted for 4 years, only concluding in April 2020, with the final conclusion that these two people did indeed have mental illnesses. Sarah was diagnosed with 2 disorders. One was obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Simply put, people with this condition often have an excessive need for orderliness and perfection, pay too much attention to details, pursue perfection, and set high standards for themselves and those around them. The second disorder was postpartum depression, with symptoms such as prolonged low mood, expressions of sadness, listlessness, fatigue, easy crying, frequent feelings of mental suppression, and easily getting angry over small things. Psychiatrists believed that it was these two disorders that made Sarah extremely aggressive and dangerous, ultimately leading to Maria's death. It was also because of these illnesses that her murder charge was reduced to manslaughter without intent, not subject to the death penalty. The maximum punishment was life imprisonment and caning. However, being a woman, she was exempt from caning. On February 23, 2021, Sarah's trial officially opened at the New York Supreme Court. With sufficient evidence and knowing she couldn't escape punishment, Sarah admitted to 1 count of manslaughter and 27 charges related to abuse. The defense lawyer argued that Sarah suffered from multiple disorders and her condition had become increasingly severe after a miscarriage in February 2016. Everything she had done was not of her own will, hoping the court would consider reducing her sentence to only 14 years in prison. However, the prosecutors believed that what Sarah had done to the domestic helper was extremely cruel and unacceptable, causing public outrage. Moreover, during the abuse, she was completely sober, had clear intentions, and knew exactly what she was doing. Therefore, she should be punished in the most severe manner, which is life imprisonment. The final verdict was initially scheduled to be announced on April 29th. Perhaps fearing a life sentence, Sarah played another trick. She changed lawyers once again, negotiating with the prosecutors in hopes of lowering the manslaughter charge from 1st degree to 2nd degree. If successful, the maximum sentence she would face would only be 15 years in prison. On June 22nd, the trial continued. Sarah's new lawyer proposed a light sentence of 8 to 9 years in prison, arguing that Maria was also at fault for not cleaning properly, which had exacerbated the defendant's condition. He also mentioned that the 4 previous domestic helpers had not been abused. Of course, the prosecutors still demanded the highest sentence. After hearing both sides, the judge made the final decision to sentence Sarah to 30 years in prison. According to the judge, no words could describe the brutality of the defendant in this case, so there was no way to reduce the sentence. However, the defendant's mental illness was a fact, so 30 years in prison was an appropriate sentence. If not for the influence of mental illness, he would certainly not hesitate to sentence her to life imprisonment. Although Sarah appealed multiple times afterward, citing many reasons to request a reduced sentence, all were rejected. The 3 judges who tried the appeal case believed that Sarah showed no remorse for Maria's death. The only thing she did after being arrested was to use her mental illness to get a reduced sentence. As for Elizabeth, she faced 50 charges but was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. On September 9, 2023, Elizabeth's trial officially opened. The prosecutors argued that her behavior was shocking and condemnable, recommending a sentence of 14 to 16 years in prison. The defense lawyer presented many reasons, including the defendant's illness and difficult circumstances, to request a reduced sentence. Finally, the judge determined that the defendant's behavior was too cruel and sentenced her to 14 years in prison. However, things didn't stop there. Do you remember the story about the surveillance cameras being removed that we mentioned earlier? After investigation, the police discovered that it was Elizabeth who had asked Michael to remove the cameras and give the hard drive to her son to keep. Fearing the police would find it, her son had given the hard drive to a friend to keep, and it was this friend who eventually turned in the hard drive to the police, revealing the truth. For this charge, the court sentenced Elizabeth to an additional 3 years in prison. Thus, her total sentence was 17 years in prison. Finally, there's the husband, Michael. Although he didn't directly harm the domestic helper, he clearly knew everything that was happening in the house. Occasionally, he even stood by and watched, but never stopped his wife. However, Sarah, or more accurately, his ex-wife, because after the incident occurred in 2020, Michael decided to divorce, stated that Michael had also laid hands on Maria. However, this statement contradicted Elizabeth's testimony. In the end, Michael faced 5 charges, including perjury, destroying evidence, and intentionally causing injury. However, for some unknown reason, to this day, his trial has not concluded. After the case was exposed, the people of New York City were extremely outraged by this family's behavior. At the same time, they expressed deep sympathy for Maria. Therefore, the Economic Migrants Humanitarian Organization of New York City organized a fundraising campaign. In just 6 days, the amount raised reached $240,000. However, the fundraising campaign was quickly halted. The organization stated that all the money raised would be transferred to Maria's family. Maria's family was extremely saddened upon hearing the news. Her sister told the media that her younger sister had to trudge to New York City to work for her son and family, but unexpectedly, after just 1 year, she had to suffer such a tragic fate. Her son would forever lose his mother. Afterward, Maria's brother came to New York City to bring his sister's body back home. The family erected a memorial in front of their house to remember their ill-fated sister. The case of Maria's murder has caused a strong shock in New York City and around the world. It should be known that domestic helpers, especially foreign domestic helpers, are a very large workforce in New York City. According to New York City's 2016 population report, the number of foreign domestic workers was about 237,100 and was rapidly increasing. By 2023, this number had reached 250,000. However, the continuous occurrences of domestic helper abuse cases have made the lives of these foreign workers even more difficult, while also negatively affecting the image of New York City. Many New York City residents have spoken out to criticize the Department of Labor and related functional agencies for not doing a good job of protecting workers. To soothe public outrage and prevent similar incidents from recurring, the New York City government has issued a series of reform measures aimed at protecting domestic workers. These include measures to prevent employers from abusing their authority, a doctor reporting system, community involvement and partner organizations, and the establishment of support centers for domestic workers to monitor employers' treatment of domestic helpers. In 2021, the government also launched a family visit program, sending labor officials to visit all apartments with hired domestic helpers across New York City for inspection. They also strengthened regular health checks for foreign domestic workers. If any abnormal signs such as injuries are detected, doctors can report directly to prevent similar tragedies. Although New York City's reforms have brought some positive results, they cannot change the fact that foreign domestic workers are still a vulnerable group. A civilized society should not be built on the exploitation of the weak. In addition, we cannot ignore another issue, which is the personal circumstances of domestic helpers. In this case, although her phone was confiscated, Maria could still go out and make phone calls. In fact, she had called home to her family in Mexico 5 times. The last call was on June 12, 2016. In the 4 previous calls, she didn't reveal any negative information. Only in the last call did she tell her sister that she felt unwell and wanted to go home in August, hoping her brother could come to pick her up. It should be noted that Mexico City is nearly 1,000 kilometers away from her village. This made her sister feel that something was wrong. August was approaching, but unfortunately she couldn't wait until then. Moreover, during the health checks, the doctor also suspected the wounds on her body, but Maria never revealed the truth. All of this shows that she had many opportunities to seek help from the outside world, but she didn't do so. Why was this? A psychologist analyzed that this could be related to her background and experiences. She was born into an extremely poor family, had a low status, and the whole family had to work hard to make a living, enduring and tolerating. Later, when she went to work far from home, for fear of losing her job, she always obeyed her employer and others. Even when treated unfairly, she only knew how to endure. This had formed in her an extremely submissive and self-deprecating psychology, not daring to disobey anyone. In modern terms, she was the type of person who always wanted to please everyone. Coming to New York City, a foreign country, coupled with her overly submissive psychology, caused her to tolerate the abusive behaviors. Perhaps in her mind, being beaten a few times was nothing. She was willing to endure bitterness and hardship for her poor family and young son back home, to avoid losing her job. She also didn't dare to tell the truth to the doctor so that her family wouldn't worry. She chose to report good news and hide bad news, but she didn't expect that her employer would be such a devil. Her obedience and endurance only made them become increasingly brutal, treating her no different from an animal. In the end, she had to pay with her life in a wrongful way. This story is also a wake-up call for all of us. In today's society governed by law, once we encounter danger, we must resolutely use the weapon of law to protect ourselves. Never rely on luck, especially in the 3-bedroom apartment of the employer. There were 2 other tenants living there. They should have known about what happened to Maria, but for 14 months, they turned a blind eye and never reported the incident. Their indifferent and apathetic attitude is truly outrageous. Today's video ends here, and I'll see you in the next videos. Goodbye.